1971, a young woman from central Illinois finished her doctoral dissertation, and the title of that dissertation was "A Study of the Effect of Training in Communicative Skills as part of the Beginning College French course on student attitude and achievement in linguistic and communicative competence." And that was a very auspicious product, if you will, that only was the beginning of a glorious career, which was punctuated by such books as the Initiatives in Communicative Language Teaching. This is two. I didn't give away, lent, but it turned out that I gave away one, in which there was a wonderful article on testing, I think a groundbreaking article on communicative testing by Dr. Savignon. 1983 was this book, and then was reissued. It was second edition came out in 1997. Communicative Competence Theory and Classroom Practice. As you can see, it's well worn. I brought this book because this is a book that we just added to our library, but it's a book that I think goes along very well with Sandra Savignon's work. This is Stephen Smith, The Theater Arts and the Teaching of Second Languages. And then, of course, the 2002 book, Interpreting Communicative Language Teaching, from which we've had 3 articles discussed and presented. But there are many, many other articles in between. And I think one of the, probably 2 or 3 of the other sorts of hallmarks that Sandra Savignon has brought to this profession was, one, really a groundbreaking founder of AAL, of which we had the conference this year in Denver. Started out as a small fledgling, well, you know the history much better than I do, but and was within the Linguistic Society of America.
Right.
And then finally, in 1988, I believe it was, you and let's see, Susan Gass.
Right.
And
We had a small committee. It was Lyle Bachman, who was the president then of AAL, and he named a committee to study the issue and said, okay, either we had 300 members and only about 50 showed up for annual meeting. So either we, disband or we become our own organization. And we decided to go for it and have our first independent meeting in New York. And now it's a big organization. So that was very exciting. It was really, I was really happy about that.
And just the name of the people who made that decision are...
Well, it was Courtney Kasdan, Sue Gass, Dick, what's his last name? Cal. No, he was at Cal.
I should know these.
Yeah. But Sue Gass was my buddy, and she chaired the committee.
And we remember that name.
And that's when I got internet, because she said, Sandra, everybody else was in applied linguistics, and I was in a French department. She said, Sandra, you got to get internet. We got to communicate, email, and so forth. So I did.
And then the other area would be as a teacher mentor and research mentor. I had the great fortune of having Sandra Savignon several times as my teacher. And in fact, I would say that there was one article from this book, the Busnardo and Braga article, that really changed who I saw myself as.
Paulo Ferrari's work,
Yeah. And we heard about Paulo Ferrari in the Kininger discussion. So Ferrari came to campus for a week, and I remember Sandra said, "You've got to go to that. You've got to see him." So of course I agreed completely and went. But the other person was when Courtney Kasdan came, and I actually had not read that much of Courtney Kasdan's work, and she said, "You've got to go to that." And I went, and have been grateful ever since. She knows her students very well and knows their needs and can really get you fired up about what you should be fired up about.
So you can become autonomous.
That's
That's the trick, that's the whole, yeah. You don't motivate students, you put them in touch with what responds to their interests and needs. They have the motivation, but they don't know how it works, or find the responsive chord sometimes that will light the spark.
So without any further ado, from Penn State, unfortunately didn't stay at Illinois her whole career, but for her maybe very fortunately.
Yeah, well, I was recruited by Penn State, but I'd done just about what I wanted to do in Illinois. So, and it was very exciting at Penn State because they didn't have any kind of, now they have an applied linguistics department, but at the time I went there, I was asked to be director of the ESL program, which was in the speech communication department. Why? Because when they started ESL, they needed an ESL program because they needed international TAs, they used to call them foreign TAs, and they need somebody to measure their language skills. And so they brought somebody in, and they put them, what do foreigners need? Well, they need the speech, they need pronunciation. So that's how they end up in speech communication department, of all places. I mean, it's really weird. So they had this ESL department in speech communication. And then shortly after I got there, we got out. It was rankers, but we got out. And now we have an applied linguistics department. Okay, one of the first in the country, actually. With all the problems that go with that, turf and so forth. But there is the reason that they could create an applied linguistics department at Penn State is because there's no linguistics department at Penn State. Because the dean had gotten rid of the linguistics department. I'm no longer at Penn State. I retired as of December. So now I'm just sort of an academic, I just freelance. It's very nice, actually, not have to deal with all the politics. Thanks, Mark. It was a wonderful introduction. I'm really happy to be here. I do have, this is I brought a copy, and I see you don't have it, so I'll pass it around if you want to. Because what I wanted to, I'm going to show some slides and talk to you a little bit about some of the highlights of my book, and I'll pass. This is the second edition that was published. It was the year I went to Penn State, and it was because Bill Van Patten said, Sandy, you got to do a second edition, you need your book. So I really updated, put in a lot more stuff about the SLA research, which has expanded, exponentially since I started. Where we used to, when I first started teaching, we had to use Roger Brown's book of first language. I taught a second language acquisition course. There was no book on second language acquisition, so we talked about what the research that was being done at Harvard on first language acquisition, because we just had theories about second language based on behaviorist psychology and structural linguistics. So we said, so therefore this is what second language learning is all about. Nobody had bothered to actually document what second language learners do. Of course, we didn't have tape recorders, when I got started either, so, it wasn't easy to gather data and analyze it. Now you can look at everything. So, this is the second edition, and if I'd known there was going to be somebody here in the Japanese program, I would have brought a copy of the Japanese translation that I just received in the mail a few weeks ago. I'm going to be in Japan in the fall. It was a tremendous undertaking to translate this text into Japanese. There's great interest, and I do a lot of work in Asia because, as you can, I'm sure, appreciate, there's great need for English language learning. English is a foreign or second language in Asia, and it's crucial. So this book, and I think I'll have time to talk a little bit about what's going on in Asia as well as the U.S. But to translate the concepts into Japanese took a team of translators several years. It was just a tremendous job because they don't have the concepts. I mean, so many of these are new the way we understand language and look at language acquisition now. So it's really good that they came up with, you know, sort of be a groundbreaking book that will provide the terminology so that Japanese learners, and there's a Chinese translation in process too now that Japan did it, the Taiwanese team. So we need one in Chinese. But to introduce the, you know, to get the terms right, because some, you know, everything can be lost in translation. So I consulted a lot, and is this what you mean? And, you know, to try to come up with the equivalents and not being backward looking and using sort of audiolingual terms, you know, to make it just a slapdash. So I think it's a good job. So enough about that. You want to put on the first slide? This is, I'm going to talk about the quest for communicative competence. I've got lots of stuff, and
If that's the SSLA or?
no, it's the other one. It says Boulder.
Okay.
Or University of Colorado. Yeah. Okay. So just kind of a nutshell overview. First one is a picture of green apples, and you can go to the next one. And when we talk about communicative competence, I think it's useful to remind learners and teachers of what the term means. Okay? And I like the term that I used in the 1997 edition. I used it in the first edition as well, actually. The interpretation, expression, and negotiation of meaning in both spoken and written language. Okay. And some of you, I suspect, have been around long enough to remember when we used to talk about the 4 skills and group them into passive skills and active skills. And reading was supposed to be passive. Listening was supposed to be passive. Okay. Well, we got over that, and we decided that, you know, actually, if you're listening, you're actively involved in trying to understand what someone is saying, similarly with reading. So we got rid of active and passive, and we replaced them with what?
Spoken and written. I said spoken and written.
Well, yeah, spoken skills, written skills. A lot of times, though, we still be subdivided further into...
Receptive and productive?
Right. Receptive and productive. Okay? So you're producing and you're receiving. And since I come from a Big Ten culture, you know, football culture, Illinois, and then, of course, Penn State, really big with football. Every time I talked about receptive and productive, I like to remind the student it's sort of like a football. And if you're the what do they call it? I think the wide end receiver and the quarterback. Okay, the quarterback sends the ball, and then you have the wide end receiver who receives the ball. And the ball is the same. The ball that's sent is the ball that's received. And so that's what productive and receptive reminds me of throwing a football downfield. Okay? Which completely ignores the basic tenet of communication, which is what is understood and expressed is not necessarily what is heard and interpreted. Okay, you got the negotiation. So I would much prefer, and I would consider, you know, encourage you, if you're tempted to talk about what kind of skills. Okay, well, there's lots of skills, but think in terms of interpretive skills, expressive skills, and negotiation of meaning. It's a better way of representing what language is all about, okay, with learners and teachers, and in the process of acquiring the skills that you need to be able to interpret and express and negotiate meaning. The next slide is simply it's from my book, and it's just a representation that I tried to give to the components of communicative competence, which were formulated by Canali and Swain, and I don't know, you may be familiar, some of you, with there in 1980. It was the first issue of that new journal, Applied Linguistics, which has gone on to become the premier journal, actually, in applied linguistics, where they talked about the various components of communicative competence. And so I've represented it as an upward, sort of an inverted pyramid to represent the idea that it's ongoing, it's never ending. That's why I have the dotted lines at the top. You don't acquire a language and then have it. It's always, it's a work in progress. And we used to think that, you stop learning language at a certain age in your life, and now we know much more about, the aging brain, and I'm really pleased to know that, you can go on and learn languages into your 80s and 90s, okay? The only thing terminal is death. Okay, we used to talk about terminal behavior. That was a famous phrase, in behavioral psychology. You want people to achieve the terminal behavior. There's nothing terminal about the acquisition of communicative competence, okay? And the other, actually those various components, and I'll just touch very briefly since we don't have much time on each one of them, but you'll notice the green section there, that was Canale and Swain based their understanding of strategic competence on the research that I did, that Mark referred to, that classroom study, experimental study that I did with classroom learners, where I was able to highlight the necessity of developing the negotiative skills, which have come to be known as strategic competence. So it's not a question. You want to go on to the next slide, grammatical competence? Using a rule, not just knowing a rule, and then for illustrative purposes, today we're going swimming, and then fill in the blank. Yesterday we went swimming. That's not showing an understanding of grammatical competence. You have to be able, excuse me, I've got that wrong. That would be, to be able to do that would be to demonstrate your grammatical competence, not to respond to the question, what's the past tense of to go? Okay. And when I was a student teacher, when I had my mentor teacher, what she used to like to do at the end of the day to sort of fill in till the bell rang was to give students a list of all the tenses of some French irregular verb, and have it, so they were doing the past subjunctive. Fill in all those forms. Okay, that's not grammatical competence. The next slide talks about discourse competence, and that's something we really do not spend enough time focusing on in classrooms. The discourse competence has to do with things I'm sure you're familiar with, such as cohesion and coherence of a text. The function, what the speaker intended, recognition of the theme or topic of a paragraph, chapter, or book, getting the gist of an email message, poem, television commercial, or a radio announcement. That was the whole purpose behind getting the français inter on the shortwave radio, so that we could give students practicing and getting the gist to develop their discourse competence. They weren't expected to know every word. They were supposed to, okay, well, there was something about this, I'm not sure. Well, you get more, and sort of piecing it together and recognizing from certain key words that what the topic was about. If you want to go on. A nice example that I like to use with teachers in training to show the role of inference and interpretation in developing discourse competence is to take this little text, and you might just look at it quickly, unscramble it. What would be the first, what do you have to do if you're going to just take a minute and say you want to put that together to make a coherent paragraph? And think about your process. What are you doing in order to do that?
You're looking for the connection. You're looking for the chronology, right?
Chronology, scenario. You have to create a context in your mind. Okay? Now, There are some other, that's sort of the coherence, to make it coherent, you know, what happened first, next, and so forth, what's it about? And then you can look for bits of sort of, you know, grammatical points which have to do with coherence, how things fit together, looking at pronouns or adverbs sometimes that will give you some help in piecing together and making a text instead of isolated sentences. Okay, how does this start in your estimation? What would you start off the paragraph with?
I would start if Chico saw a policeman coming down the street.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. We don't have much time, so. Yeah, Chico saw a policeman coming down the street. Suddenly he turned and ran. The 5th Street bus had just passed him by and he was going to be late for school again. There was no time to ask about Pedro. Maybe tomorrow.
It still doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't.
No. I don't see how that's connected at all.
Okay.
I mean, the first 2 sentences, okay, and then the third sentence is a thing all by itself, and then the last 2 sentences are a thing. But I don't see a connection between all of those.
Okay.
I can make sense. Like, if I say I just opened a book to some random page and read just this one paragraph, I would say that it makes sense because I know that there's another context that I need to realize I don't really know yet.
Okay. But how, okay, so you take, but let's just take it as is. What could this be about? Huh?
A child who is supposed to be in school, maybe,
Yeah.
and if he's not in school, he'll get told by the policeman.
Sure.
Yeah, and but it'd have to be culturally. It's in a different culture than here,
Well,
I think. But why I question why is he late? Who's he talking to about Pedro? Is that?
I get the first 3 as kind of like an internal monologue, you know, okay, so he sees the cop, he turns and runs, and then also that's going on, he's going to be late for school, but my question is that the first 3 sentences seem to fit together well, and the last 2 seem to fit together well, but my question is what's going on with Pedro, and who is he asking? Was he going to ask the policeman? Was he going to ask his friend that he was with, who's not mentioned? That is the part that, if anything, was unclear to me.
well, yeah. Actually, this came from the idea that there was something wrong with Pedro. Maybe Pedro was in jail, or the policeman knew something about Pedro. And Chico saw the policeman, and he wanted to ask him about his friend Pedro. In other words, he wasn't running from the policeman. See, so often you get the context, you know, they all policemen, you know, but no, this was his friend Pedro, and he wanted to find out something from the policeman. But then the bus was going by, so there was no time to ask the policeman. So he had to take the bus maybe tomorrow. You have a chance. If you saw him again, might as well wait for the bus. See? So you make a scenario. You'll notice how Chico saw, you see the little star there, Chico saw a policeman coming down the street, suddenly he turned and ran. There was no time to ask about Pedro. The 5th Street bus had just passed him by, and he was going to be late for school again. You couldn't have that order because him would refer back to Pedro. And it's Chico who's going to mess them up. So you see, that's where you come up with this bit, these, you know, cohesive devices we talk about, and the links that put language together. Okay, so some of it becomes grammatical and it helps you figure out what makes sense. And when you violate those, I mean, the useful thing to do is if students are working on putting text together or even making sense out of texts, isolated sentences, sharing them with classmates and having them look to see, well, you can't do this. Because then there is a grammatical focus to it. It's just on a larger scale than sentence-level grammar. It's still grammar, okay? But in your head, you still have to have a scenario. So, I don't know your name.
Danny.
Does the scenario, I mean, does it make
Yeah.
sense there? You know, but it didn't
Well,
fit
it's
your,
stress.
because you were thinking probably policeman, Chico was probably running, you know, there were things, there was some static there for you.
I just didn't see any
Right.
connection.
Right, yeah. See, and that's how often, depending on the context and your life experiences, that's why we're so, because things, you know, in another culture don't make any sense to you at all. And that's why it's so difficult for language learners, if you give them texts that are alien to them culturally, geographically, historically, as well as linguistically, then you're putting, there's too much. You know, so you have to deal with things that relate to their experiences so that they can make use of their discourse strategies to make sense of what the words feed and focus on some of requiring some of the new lexical items and so forth. The next slide is strategic competence, and I just give you a couple of examples of how we use strategic competence all the time as fluent native speakers. They're both from my own life experience. I make a lot of use of my life experience in my research. The mother, this is, who's traveling. I called home, and we have 3 children at home, and our daughter Catherine answered, I have a collect call from Sandra, will you accept the charges? And Catherine said, I'm sorry, she's not here right now. So, you know, this is a call for Sandra. Okay. And the operator then adjusted to her and said, it's from Sandra, will you accept it? This is before we had cell phones, okay? So I'm there, oh my God, she's not gonna accept the call, and I can't reach her, so when we're gonna, oh yes, okay, so then I was able to get through. Okay. And the second one was my husband. We were in, actually it wasn't New York, it was in Champaign, Urbana, Illinois. A visiting Frenchman has just ordered a Swiss cheese sandwich. What kind of bread do you want for your sandwich? White, whole wheat, or rye? Why? White? Why? White? Whole wheat. So he had whole wheat, but he didn't have to take white. But at least stay away from white. Okay. French can't say rye. Maybe he can. I can try it. Maybe if he really works at it.
He's gonna be here at lunch, right?
Yeah, he's coming from. We had you can't say age either to aspirate age. So we used to have a colleague, Herb DeLay, that when he would see him down the hall, he'd always say, I Herb. That's cute. That's why we love him. So, social cultural competence, you know, and that you're aware of roles of relationship, what's appropriate, and that native and non-native, and that's a big issue in terms of identity. Okay, power and identity. I didn't ask you, I mean, because you all introduced yourself, but typically when I give a talk to teachers or teacher educators, I ask the question, how many of you are bilingual? Okay. Why don't you raise your hand? How many of you are bilingual? Okay, well then I see some people are not raising their hand. So, okay, you're not bilingual?
I'm not sure.
So you're monolingual?
Well, I know other languages. but
Ah,
I don't know
see, okay, so this is a big thing with is power and identity, and we've become acculturated because of the way the language instructional programs are structured, and our own idea that they're somehow, you know, the old books, language for mastery, French for mastery, Spanish for mastery, that you're supposed to master something. Well, I'm bilingual, and I haven't mastered French, and I haven't mastered English. Okay, but I can get by in both. Okay, and I can do some things better and some. It took me a great deal of time to learn how to write scholarly papers in English after I'd been a French literature major, because I was used to writing scholarly papers on French literature in French. Okay, so there's a whole style, and you know, but through practice, I got so that I could do it. You can't be a little bilingual. It's sort of like pregnant. You know, if you know another language, and think of it. You know, you're monolingual or you're bilingual. What, you know, And we don't have time to go into this today, but I would encourage you to consider Joshua Fishman, who was a well-known sociolinguist, who talked about the bilingual dominance configuration. In other words, and in the European Union, they have what they call linguistic passports, which describe what you can do in the various languages that you can use. Okay, can you answer the telephone? Could you, we're not going to send everybody to negotiate a treaty. Okay, and a lot of people couldn't do this in their so-called native language to begin with, right? So we have various talents, and it also is going to depend on how recently you've used those skills. And we notice that they can go up and they can go down, they can be revived. But you relieve yourself of a lot of frustration if you just simply consider yourself bilingual, but that doesn't mean that you're perfectly bilingual, which is a non-existent phenomenon. There's nobody who can do everything the same and as well in two languages. I defy you. And I know you're going to say, oh yeah, but I know somebody, and I'm just like a native in both languages. Sure, if you're talking in a bar or, in a classroom setting, but they're not going to have the cultural baggage in both languages because you'd have to live parallel lives. I can speak fluent French, and I've been taken for French native, but I wasn't raised in a French boarding school. I don't begin to have the cultural knowledge that I would have if I were raised French. Okay? And my husband, who was raised in a French Jesuit boarding school, has been away from France for many years, and he can't begin to relate to what some of the young people in France are experiencing today. You see, so we have, our life experiences are so varied, and so there's no such monolithic thing as, French, native French. Those terms are gone. We're not, we're stuck with them because, we talk about native and near native, but they don't serve us well when we're talking about language and language acquisition. That's the point I want to make. Negotiation, principles, languages, communication. You want to go on to principles of CLT? Yeah. Languages, communication, diversity in language development, relative competence, variety of language models. Language as culture, Clark Comsch makes a big point of this and talks about it. Language is culture in motion. Okay? We are influenced, our culture influences our language influences our culture, and we as individuals or as groups can influence how language is used. Okay? Terms change. Okay? Depending on the groups that are using it, and as some groups acquire more power, then they have more power to change the language and influence the language that is used, and this is nowhere more important than in the political realm. People try to introduce the terms to talk about the issue so that it's being discussed on their terms. Okay. It's a very powerful tool, language. What it is not, the next slide. The concern of CLT is not exclusively with face-to-face oral communication. I think that notion developed because it came about. We started talking about CLT at a time when audiolingual methods were so prevalent and the focus was on oral communication. But of course, written communication is just as important. And now we have these sort of between, email, chat, Twitter. Is it writing? Is it speaking? It's new. Okay, and the kids are going to be controlling it much faster than we are. So when we're talking about learner autonomy, as we were earlier, you see that by encouraging their autonomy and getting them to use, and access these areas where language is being used, they're going to go far beyond what teachers are able to provide for them. Okay. And the models of language may not be the ones that we as teachers would say was, the most correct or the best and so forth, but don't be. That's the way language and that's the way society is evolving. It does not require small group work. I think small group work is fine, but some classes are so big that it's just not possible. It doesn't mean complete rejection of familiar materials, and it does not exclude a focus on meta-linguistic awareness or a knowledge of rules of syntax, discourse, and social appropriateness. Those are fine, but that's sort of what I call language arts, talking about language, and should not replace language use or experience in the interpretation, expression, and negotiation of meaning. And this next slide, which I like to include when I'm speaking to Asian audiences, because I learned it from a Taiwanese student of mine, beware of hanging on a sheep's head to sell dog meat. We don't eat dog meat, and we don't eat so much mutton. Well, I guess we do, but it's a very common expression in Chinese. In other words, it's like what a wolf in sheep's clothing, or be sure that even though the book says this is communicative, look at it closely and ask yourself, is the focus on texts and discourse? Do teachers expect and encourage risk-taking? And are the learners engaged in the interpretation, expression, and negotiation of meaning? That's, okay, I've got more. Do you want to ask questions? Because I don't need to keep talking to you. I mean, I can stop and you can ask me questions, or we can go on. I have a lot more stuff, so I need to come back another time.
I think we could just soak you in all day long. I personally, I could listen to you for a long time, and I think last Wednesday we stayed till 12:30 or so, and people were very generous for their time to do that. But I think we got a lot out of it, and so I personally don't have any time constraints.
Okay, well, do you want me to just go through a few more slides? Okay. Okay. If you want to ask questions, raise your hand. Okay, just challenge me or stop me. Because this is then touching on what you were talking about earlier, and I suspect that throughout your workshop, the next slide where it says teachers need support. One of my former students from Penn State, one of my doctoral students, is a supervisor of teachers in Costa Rica, which is a small, very democratic, called the Switzerland of Latin America. And he wrote to me in an email, and he said, English teaching for communication in the Costa Rican public school system. Oh, that's my husband. I forgot. He must have found his way. So they called him before I started talking, and he said, I hope je trouve maintenant, I forgot to turn off the phone. Because he's joining us.
I wouldn't have pictured you having that ringtone.
Why don't you talk to him? Just say, salut,
Hello?
Tell him I'm giving my talk.
I don't know if is it on.
It should be. Hello? Raise it again.
Okay.
Tell him. Okay. And you have two jobs, answer cell phone and, okay, teachers and support. This year we started the implementation, like so many countries, we started the implementation of a new modern communicative syllabi. Plural somewhere. Yeah, plural, okay. This logically implies nice tasks and evaluation of all skills in a communicative way at all levels. But I don't know what happens. Many times teachers do not want to have fun in their classes, and they just keep on doing the same old routine of written grammar exercises, translation, and so forth. Okay, that's from Renee. The next one, teachers need support. And this was Cho Chang Wang, and actually there's a chapter by her in that Yale book that you used, and I don't know if you read it or not. I was just in Taiwan actually a month or so ago, and spent a couple of weeks there doing some teaching. Students are all, if you can imagine, I mean, I teach in English, obviously, and they interacted with me in English, and they're all going to be teachers of English, so it's a wonderful setting, much different than what we find in the States so often. I mean, the level of competence is quite wonderful, but they're still struggling and they want to be even better. Much has been done to meet the demand for competent English users and effective teaching in Taiwan. Certain current improvements, according to the teacher experts, include the change in entrance exams, the new curriculum with the goal of teaching for communicative competence, and the island-wide implementation in 2001 of English education in the elementary schools. They're down to the 5th grade now. This is true in Korea as well. However, more has to be done to ensure quality teaching and learning in the classrooms. Based on the teacher experts' accounts, further improvements can be stratified into 3 interrelated levels related to teachers, school authorities, and the government. Each is essential to the success of the other's efforts. In other words, you can't do it by yourself as teachers, and so often teachers get frustrated. You know, they come out of a methods course and they're inspired, and they find themselves in the bureaucracy with the parents and the teachers and the administrators, and it's too much. Okay, so it has to be a concerted, collaborative effort where everyone understands what language is and how it's learned. The next slide we'll just go over quickly, but it's about CLT in South Korea. And South Korea is actually one of the countries where they've made the most progress and are most advanced in terms of English language teaching. You know, they have internet access for the whole entire population. I mean, everybody's connected and they're very advanced. And yet there was this article that appeared in TESOL Quarterly about how difficult it was to implement communicative language teaching. And so a lot of people looked at that and said, oh, you see, it's not going to work. It's not going to work in Asia. Too complicated and so forth. The next one is Hong Kong. And I think Lang Cheng has I think there's a paper by her in this Yale book as well. She's become very, very well known for her work in testing and working. What's happening in Hong Kong is that learners used to be more proficient in English, but now since the mainland has replaced the formerly British administration, English is not used as widely for real-life purposes as it was previously. So the English language skills of students is going down. And that's a real concern. So they've had widespread reform when they tried to change the exam. And they thought if they could just change the test, then the teachers would change their teaching. And what she found with her observations over several years during this transition was that you go into a classroom and teachers were explaining to students how to have a conversation, or explaining to them how to do group work, rather than giving them the opportunity to do group work. And you look puzzled.
No, I think it's...
Explaining it, yeah, telling them how to do it, rather than letting them do it. Okay, so we see the same tension again, but how are they going to become autonomous if you won't let them loose? Well, because they'll make mistakes. It's like we used to do the audiolingual. We do all those drills and sample conversations, and then the final end of the chapter was supposed to be where the students would have their own free conversation based on the structures and the vocabulary that had been presented. And of course they couldn't. So we'd say, okay, well, we're running late, so we got to get on to the next chapter. We just squashed that because it was so painful. Okay, because obviously they couldn't do it, at least not with the native-like proficiency that was, presumed to be the outcome of all these wonderful structure drills. The next one, CLT in the USA, and this is some recent work by another student of mine who, actually, Bridget Burke, who's at, as of next fall, she's going to be at Bowling Green University in the education department, foreign language education in Ohio. She was an undergraduate teacher education, French teacher ed at Illinois when I was the supervisor of teacher education program, French department. And I remember Bridget came into my office and she said, I want to be a teacher of French, and she was a great swimmer and she wanted to graduate. She had her timetable all set up, and I said, well, Bridget, you have to go to France. When are you going to go to France. What? I have to go to France? I said, yeah, you gotta really learn French. Oh. So she took a year and we went to France, and she turned out she did an honors undergraduate dissertation, and she came back, she's all gung-ho and happy. And then she taught in an inner city school in Chicago for several years, went to Harvard and did a master's in education, and was really inspired. And so she came to Penn State, and she worked with she supervised foreign language teachers, and did her PhD with me at Penn State. And graduated, had a couple of kids, and her husband got through law school. Now she's got a job at Bowling Green. And in the meantime, she's done some research, and it was about, she taught methods courses at Penn State, and then she was working with teachers in the public schools to watch the transition of these methods teachers as they went out into the classroom to see what happened to them. And her first, I like this, this is from a couple, this was from the same article in the Foreign Language Annals. Grammar translation teachers spend a greater amount of time teaching grammatical forms than focusing on language that is meaningful to the students. And this was a quote from one of the student teachers that went out. At the beginning of the lesson, I tried to teach the subjunctive imperfect. Must be a French, maybe not. However, I realized that most of the students did not know how to form the imperfect or how to use it. I spent about 40 minutes reviewing the imperfect, subjunctive, and subjunctive imperfect. So obviously they already learned it, but they hadn't learned it, so we have to review it. You spend most of your time reviewing what they're supposed to have learned, and everybody ends up being discouraged. The problem with the lesson plan was that afterwards my mentor teacher told me that I'd spent too much time on grammar. This caught me by surprise, because I thought the lesson had gone a little okay. I felt like I needed to spend some time on the review, and I suppose that since I'm so used to teacher-centered classes in college, that I was unaware that students would not be able to focus on grammar for 40 minutes. What does that tell you about what's going on at the university? Teacher-centered class teachers. So where did they learn to, encourage autonomy, learner autonomy? And then in some of her summary statements about this, study that she did, only some this is the next slide, CLT in the USA. Only some pre-service teachers included communicative activities in their lessons during the field experience. Even though university method students had studied and discussed SLA theory, including the theory and research that supports CLT, and had developed and facilitated communicative activities during para-teaching lessons in the methods course, in their field experience, they still emphasized grammar at the expense of communication. So they get out, and what do? Her work, her book-length project is looking at the deep structure of education in the U.S. going back to edicts back in the beginning of the 20th century about the goals and so forth of teaching, to show how entrenched this grammatical focus is in the curriculum. And we don't have time to talk about that. I mentioned a little bit in my book. When modern language teachers were finally accepted into, well, like Harvard, it was in 1890, something like that. First of all, they weren't considered, modern languages were not considered appropriate for school programs. You're supposed to learn those on your own. Okay, and most of the population in the U.S. was from some other language background anyway, a lot of them German. So, they did.
Americans.
Yeah, so, they were trying to learn English, okay? And you could go to Saturday school in German, and there were lots of German newspapers, and I don't know about all the other, but certainly Spanish, it's always been with us, and it's still with us. So it was only very recently, actually, that modern languages were accepted into school curricula, and Spanish even more recently. German was one of the first, along with French, And the great pressure on the teachers of those modern languages was to be accepted and respected the way the teachers of Latin and Greek were. And so you taught language analysis, you taught grammatical analysis because that was good for developing thinking skills. The other thing you could teach would be the history of the language, historical linguistics. So those were the fields. And then, of course, literature. Although when I took literature courses, I was a major in French literature, most of my professors taught their courses on French literature in English. They didn't speak French. That was beneath them. You know, they just did grammatical and linguistic and literary analysis. Okay. So it's been a long, you can see how the attitudes are there and entrenched and they're still very visible today. Yeah.
Well, also, I think it's an easy way to teach, to do grammar exercises. And I see this sometimes with my TAs, you know, and then sometimes they do and sometimes they don't, show me this little worksheet that they made up to practice direct objects in the accusative case and stuff. You know, and I say, how do you have time to do that in class?
Yeah. No,
But I think it's an easy way to teach also.
it's laid out, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And we'll learn it once, and then they still haven't learned it, so then we'll do it again, and you keep repeating it, and then, you know, that's why I think it's very liberating to think of yourself think of yourselves as bilingual, because then, you know, you're not expecting miracles, and you're more accepting of yourself, which will make you in turn more accepting of your students. As parents, we all know that, you know, our problem is, you know, there's things that we didn't do or we wish we'd done, and when we have children, we think, okay, now they're not going to make the same mistakes I did, or they're going to be perfect, and I'm going to watch everything, and then you realize you've got to let go, you can't control them either. But I think if you're happy with yourself and what you've done and accept yourself, then you can be more accepting of your learners or your children. You know, let them explore. Not set up unrealistic expectations, which lead then to inevitably to disappointment. So all three of our children speak French, and if Mark comes back, there's one slide I didn't know how much time I had, and I have another whole mass of slides that looks at second language acquisition. Oh, you know how to? Oh, you know how to? Okay. Well, if you close that. You'll see another file that looks at SSLA under Mark's connection. You can just yeah.
How does grading fit into all this? Unfortunately, we have to evaluate students based on pure correctness or incorrectness, and grading is something that I really struggle with.
I do too.
I hate it. It's my least favorite part of teaching, and I always wish on some level that we could just do away with it, but I always come back and I have to tell myself it's part of my job to submit some kind of fair evaluation of the progress of each student, and it usually measures in some way their competence in pure grammar, and I think that's why maybe that's emphasized so much, because that's where we expect them to achieve and show their knowledge.
Well,
I'm just wondering if you have any advice.
Well, and that's of course do a whole lot of seminars on assessment, because the measuring tools that we have that we feel compelled to use don't fit what we're trying to measure.
Right.
They're inappropriate. Okay? And one of my early experiences was working with teachers. Well, no, it was in the Illinois Department of Education, where they were trying to assess bilingual teachers. Did they know enough Spanish to be bilingual teachers in the public school system? And I explained to them that they should have the students, you know, get up and do like a mock lesson or something where they'd be required to use Spanish so they could evaluate them in a setting. And these supervisors rebelled. I was very young at the time. And they said, no way. They wanted to use what's an ETS, Educational Testing Service, grammar test in Spanish. Why? Because ETS had the test, they would be graded by ETS, they would get a score, be a numerical score, and that way they wouldn't be victim to any lawsuits that teachers who didn't get certified as bilingual teachers could bring up, because it was ETS test, graded by a computer, untouched by human hands except for people who made up the test, and it's totally inappropriate for what it's supposed to serve. But they didn't want to be in the messy business of actually watching somebody teach and assessing whether they or not they were competent to teach. You see, and that's what we're seeing in No Child Left Behind. I mean, it's all everything that it's empirical, which makes it seem like it's objective, which means that it's true. Completely misunderstanding that these test instruments are developed, and I mean the whole business of construct validity. It's kind of complicated. I won't even go there today, but it's not reflecting the construct of communicative competence, which is it takes two to communicate. It's like, okay, depending, you have an accent, maybe your English doesn't sound like my Midwestern, Illinois English. If you're my boss, be sure I'm going to understand everything you say or make an effort to. If you're my maid, you're not going to do as well.
It happened to me once. I was calling a friend, and since I have an Hispanic accent, her mom was taking care of her kids. So the mom said, "Oh, who is the maid?" And I said, "No, I'm her friend." But the mom has this idea that if you have a Hispanic accent, I must be the maid.
Right. And those are the things that we're dealing with it when we're talking about, new critical pedagogy. But they're hard things for people to understand. Who are you, and so why do I take you seriously, and how much effort am I going to make to communicate with you, and so on and so forth. And that's why the issues of power and identity are so important. So you have to muddle through. You just have to muddle through, and you have to kind of. But I think that under this umbrella of communicative language teaching, you are seeing at least lip service to things like task-based instruction or content-based instruction, where if you can understand something, if you're teaching a course in, say, French history or French geography or whatever the topic is, if you can assess on the basis of material understood, content acquired, that's one way of getting around, or whatever the topic is. And this is what happens in immersion programs when they use it in elementary school. I've seen elementary school programs in immersion schools where kids talk about motivation. Third graders they had Spanish and German schools that I visited. And little third graders were sitting in the back and passing notes to each other in German. Because at home they spoke English, but at school the teacher, everything was in German. There was no need to speak German, speak German. That's just what they did. So there you have assessment is much easier. But you have to kind of muddle through and have different categories and don't make it all grammatical accuracy or spelling, or you're going to lose 3/4 of your students who are not good at grammar and not good at spelling. But maybe they could get the gist of, you have to provide a variety of tasks. What was that? If you want, I just wanted to share with you, since I'm here. I won't talk to you about my study because it was a classroom study, and it was the first empirical study of classroom learners, beginning classroom learners. And it undisputedly showed that students who were given the opportunity from the very beginning to express their meaning, to focus on meaning as opposed to form. I'm not saying that they didn't care about form, I'm saying they were focusing on meaning. Get the difference? They were focusing on meaning and using forms. You cannot communicate without grammar. Okay, grammar means structure, and unless we have some shared system of putting pieces of language together, which is what grammar is, we cannot communicate. Okay? But they were focusing on meaning, and in the audiolingual presentation of language acquisition, you see you had to get it accurate before you used it. You had to use it accurately in order to develop bad habits. Okay? And I was able to demonstrate very convincingly that with all this focus on getting their meaning across and all the opportunities that that implied for making lots of grammar mistakes, they were still better on grammar than those students who were just focusing on grammatical accuracy, and particularly going into the language lab to do the same drills over and over and over again. Okay? Language labs did not come out looking very good in my study, which made this hard to get published first, because a lot of money was being spent on language labs and promoting language labs and language lab materials. Imagine the whole industry. Yeah. Okay, so try to publish a study that shows that the time spent in the language lab was time wasted.
What about the workbooks now that come with textbooks that have listening, comprehension, kind of based, not the same repeating exactly word for word what they had in the textbook, but different? I mean, they still have lab books.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you
I
have to...
hate it, and I hate it.
Do they?
Yeah, they do. And I say, we've always hated workbooks, but
Yeah.
they hate it.
Yeah.
Do you get that from your students, that they hate the workbooks? I'm just saying
Yeah.
it's not.
You know, that they might be better off, you know, going on the internet to find out information about, you know, projecting, I don't know what, preparing a budget, planning a trip, settling a world, you know, diplomatic issue. I don't know what the task might be, but where they're actually doing it in the language, gathering materials,
Right.
making sense of it,
It's not just repeating.
rather than just repeating,
No, it's not
just
just
rehearsing.
I think a lot of students and teachers gain comfort from those mechanical exercises because it's just so ingrained in their background of how to be a
Yeah.
good learner and
Right.
teacher, you know.